For this week's lecture on informative speaking, I thought I'd bring you the most informative person on the planet, good old red-blooded American. Because when that virus comes to my door, I'm gonna fill it full of hot lead.
Okay, so chapter 13, the informative speech. So most of you folks have gotten your outlines in. Yay, thank you so very much. Pretty much right now we're at a stance where about 2/3 of my classes are getting their outlines in. So you folks are already part of that small crew that's fighting and trying to get through. So since you're writing up your informative speeches, I thought I'd give you folks some tips and tricks on chapter 13. So when you're practicing it this week and trying to figure out how to get your informative speech together for next week, you can add in a couple of extra moments of flair, extra little points that you need to talk about. So first of all, let's talk about some guidelines for just informative speaking in general. Now, as you were writing your outlines, you probably had this new concept that was kind of thrown in there, this notion of what we call audience analysis. And in chapter 11, there's a little bit of information about how audience analysis works, and comes down to it all, it's really about trying to make your topic applicable to the other people that are out there, the people that are listening to you. So in informative speaking, this is really, really powerful because you can give any informative speech about something, and if the audience doesn't care about it, they're not going to listen to you. So you want to make sure that you take that information and you center it in on the actual audience themselves. So when you're thinking about any particular topic area, there's always an angle that you can take to make it more applicable or more reasonable to them. So, for example, I think in the last lecture, I talked about Social Security being this big concept that would be really, really applicable to people who are 65 and older. But, you know, for people your age, you probably don't give much of a damn about it. But what you can do is you can kind of twist it a little bit. You can take the concept of Social Security and bring it to your audience. So for you folks, you're probably really concerned about the fact that you have to pay into Social Security, but you're not going to get anything out of it because most of the research shows that it will be insolvent by the year 2030. So most of you folks are going to end up paying for my ass when I decide to retire. I'm sure you're pretty ticked off about that, especially given the quality of instruction you're getting right now. Another piece of advice that people give you with regards to informative speaking is making sure you pick just the right amount of information. So sometimes you might pick a topic that's too big, then eventually you just kind of cut across the outside of it, you skip the surface, and so you don't go deep enough to your audience. And then on the other hand, you might be in a scenario where you have too much depth.
Estoy en clase.
What's up?
Oh, shoot. I'm sorry. I'm at work. I'm sorry. I'm right here. I'm in the car.
Oh, okay. No worries, man. Jeez, I got cats jumping behind me and crazy ass roommates, and oh man, you don't even know. Okay, so limiting the information, right? So you want to make it a manageable bite. So, you know, a lot of students were picking broad topics, you know, like stress or sleep or something like that. And if you just do an entire speech about sleep in general, you're not really going to dive in that much into one area that makes it really interesting to your audience. However, if you focus a speech on, like, let's say sleep into NREM versus REM memory or eye movement cycles, you know, you might make it more interesting to give something meaningful to the actual audience. And this gets down to this notion of adjusting the level of complexity. So you always want to say that, well, yeah, my audience, where's their knowledge level at? And since you're talking to college students, odds are they're smarter than the average bears. They're going to know a little bit of information out there. And as you adapt the level of knowledge to them, you want to make sure that you're teaching them something new. So you're going deeper into your research, you're establishing your ethos, and you're trying to give them something that's meatier for them to understand. You also want to make sure that you got enough for the time available. So 6 minutes flies by really, really fast. You'd be surprised. So you want to make sure that you just get yourself a nice little tidbit and you get that information in there so that other people can understand what you're talking about. There's also a purpose, right? You're trying to teach us about something. So if you're doing a process speech, you're trying to demonstrate or teach us how to do a particular task. Or if you're just informing us about, like, let's say a definition or a concept, you're just trying to come up with a general idea overall. So the purpose you hope to achieve also affects your time constraints a little bit because, for example, tons and tons of students almost always like to do the origami speech, right, for their informative, and every single time it ends up going overtime. They end up picking this complex little crane thing. They're trying to teach everybody how to fold the paper, and then everybody's got questions. They can't fold it right, and next thing you know, they're going overtime because they're trying to teach people how to do something that's too big for the amount of time that they have allocated. Finally, of course, your topic area gives you certain limitations that are out there as well. So when you think about the actual topic you've chosen, you want to make sure that you've narrowed it in just enough that you can handle it in a manageable 6-minute window. When you're coming up with areas or when you're explaining topics out of your particular speech, you want to try and relate new information to old information that's out there. So there's a lot of, kind of tips, tricks, parallelism or different types of analogies that you can use to try and take new information and relate it to old information that's out there. Oftentimes, especially in this coronavirus outbreak right now, there are tons and tons of comparisons, right? So I'm sure you folks have had some of those friends who say, oh, it's just like the flu, right? Or then there's other people that are comparing it to the Spanish flu. It's because human beings need a reference point. We're great categorizers, but if we have an easier reference point to go back to, it makes it easier for us to remember the topic area that you're chatting about. And so if you have something that's kind of novel or new that you're trying to explain to the audience, relating it back to old information might be a really effective way of getting that across. Now, also, you want to make sure that you use the heuristic tricks to make information easier for the audience to remember. So you want to make sure that you repeat or restate your main important points. So remember, repetition is key to persuasion. Repetition is key to persuasion. Repetition is key to persuasion. And inside of the speech, we've talked about this, that remember, it seems really tedious, but you're always going to repeat those main points. In your preview statement, you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them. You tell them 1, 2, and 3. Then you move into the body of your speech where you tell them every one of your topic sentences is 1, 2, and 3. And then when you get to the conclusion of your speech, you're doing it again. You're reviewing, telling them about how we discussed 1, 2, and 3. And it's pretty key for us as individuals to have that repetition because, even if you listen to modern day commercials, if there's a phone number or a web address, you'll almost always hear it 3 times throughout the course of the commercial. This is sort of this mental heuristic that allows people to follow your speech, understand where you're at. And remember, much like in the listening lecture, at any given point in time, only 1 out of 5 students is actually listening to you. So you need to repeat those concepts in case they missed it the first time. You can also use guide phrases. So inside of your outlines, I noticed a lot of you folks were pretty good about putting transitions in there. Way to go. And so these guide phrases or transitions, telling us that we've just discussed one particular moment and now we're going to move on to another particular moment, gives us another opportunity to make that information easy to remember by repeating the key points inside of your speech. As we start to get more advanced, and for some of you folks maybe even in this presentation as well, you can start to use internal summaries or internal previews. So not only a transition, but inside of the transition, you actually review the main points that you have out there. So, obviously this is a simplistic topic, but let's say you're doing a speech on how to bake a cake, right? So you probably have a natural structure. So the first point is probably going to be the materials that you need. So you need to get eggs and butter and milk and sugar. And then the middle point's probably going to be the process. So you're going to have, first you're going to mix together your wet ingredients, then you got to mix together your dry ingredients, and then you got to mix them together and make sure it's not lumpy, et cetera, et cetera. And then the final point is probably going to be baking the cake, right? So you can just stick the cake in the oven. So when you get the largest of these 3 points is probably going to be the process. So maybe when you get to the end of point 2, you can say, now that we've discussed the directions on how to prepare the cake, i.e. we just talked about mixing your dry ingredients, mixing your wet ingredients, mixing them together until it's nice and smooth. Now let's turn to the final step of the process, which is baking the cake. So an internal summary transition gives you another opportunity to repeat your main points. In addition to this, you can kind of try and pattern your messages. So a lot of, advanced speakers like to use techniques like alliteration and assonance inside of their speeches. So, for example, I wrote a paper in organizational communication about a decade ago that went to a conference, and we were trying to figure out the main points. And so we were talking about creativity in the organization, and so then we talked about the creative person, the creative process, and the creative product, right? So, and they were all P's, and I thought I was so clever because I came up with them. But if there's a way that you can use alliteration, like P sounds over again, or assonance, A sounds over again, oftentimes these make it a little bit easier for the audience to remember your main points too. And finally, of course, remember you want to focus your audience's attention down. So as you're moving from point to point, you want to make sure that you refocus in on the audience, making sure that you're redrawing them back in, telling them why it's applicable, or the important points of what you're particularly trying to discuss. Now, when it comes to informative speaking, and after you folks have shot your videos, we're going to have everybody look over at least one video, and then you're going to end up writing a critique about it. So kind of give you some larger, broad swaths of what types of informative speeches we have. First, of course, we can have speeches of description. So this is a speech that explains an object, a person, an event, or a process. So, for example, some people might talk about the structure of the brain, right? So we could talk about, the basal ganglia and the medulla oblongata, and then move up to the prefrontal cortex. All these are just parts of an object that's up. And, if you got a little brain, you could kind of show it in front of the audience. And speeches about objects tend to work out pretty well. You could also do a speech about a person. So you could talk about the contributions of, let's say, Thomas Edison, if you want to, all the stuff he did with regards to electricity and the light bulb, etc. Or you could go back to what we talked about in the very first lecture of the class, the different parts of a telephone, right, that we speak into a drum and it reverberates off a magnet. And then, of course, creates an electromagnetic force that goes down a wire and then eventually gets to another receiver. You could do a spatial analysis, like a place. So, like, for example, the layout of Philadelphia. So you could talk about the north side of Philadelphia, the south side of Philadelphia, the west or the east. You could talk about the hierarchy of a corporation. So it's pretty funny. By the way, folks, if you get any emails from me asking for money or any of that stuff, please ignore them. So I guess there's a lot of phishing attacks that are happening now on Cyprus. So our chair got hacked. And I think it's kind of clever, right? Because when you're emailing somebody inside of Cyprus, it gives you the full hierarchy, right? So if you click to email me, it says Qasim reports to this person, that person reports to somebody else, and then who reports to me. So I think that, a clever Fisher person out there got into the system and said, oh, okay, well, here's a department chair. So if I hack her, then I got a good chance of getting Qasim to give me some extra money, right? So I ended up getting these blasted emails about it all. And I think that one of the unfortunate side effects of having a corporate model already laid out at Cypress College is that it's really easy for you to sort of abuse a position of power and then take advantage of a bunch of the subordinates. So a bunch of the adjunct faculty members actually got trapped into it, ended up buying Google Play cards for our chair, and she was like, no, it's a hoax. And I was, oh my gosh, thank God I didn't buy into it. Finally, of course, you could describe another object out there, like the components of a computer system. You can talk about like a CPU, and then talk about the hard drive, or you can talk about the memory structures, all the different parts of it, and then that sort of gives you a nice little structure for your speech. So now, gosh, we got 9 people in here. How many of you folks are doing informative speech on a speech of description? Anybody going out there?
I might be. Mine's on climate change. Is that considered an event?
Yeah, I would definitely say climate change is, well, actually both an event and a process, probably, right? Climate change is a process that we're going through, and I think eventually in the future we'll describe it as a pretty big event when finally something ends up going pretty crazy.
I guess mine is description than actually a Bitcoin.
Oh yeah, totally, right? That's an object that's out there, or a digital object that's out there.
I think mine is animal, endangered animals.
Yeah, endangered animals, right? Yeah, so there's a process and a bunch of objects that are out there. Those poor little endangered animals that are out there. Yeah, good stuff. All right, cool. All right, well, let's move on to our next one here. So most speeches tend to be speeches of description. So moving on here, the next type of informative speech that you folks might be engaging in is a speech of definition. So actually, climate change might have a definition in it, and Bitcoin might have a definition in it too, because they might be a little bit more in depth, but there are some speeches that are just complete definitions. This is where we focus in on defining an actual term, a system, or a theory. A system or a theory, pinpointing the similarities or differences between 2 different systems too. So you can talk about, 2 different competing systems, and then show the similarities or differences between them. So for example, if you're trying to explain how a smart card works, right? How do I get into these buildings with this crazy card, right? Or maybe a larger theoretical concept like machismo, so this is a cultural variable that we see with all these guys running around. You could try and define political correctness. Man, I don't know about you folks, but geez, man, if I have to hear one more person going off about the Chinese virus, oh God, man, I'm gonna lose my mind. But political correctness, of course, another concept that's out there inside of our lives. You could take a larger, more theoretical perspective on an actual religion. So you could talk about the major beliefs in Confucianism. You could talk about something artistic, like let's say expressionism, or even in my field, there's what we call play theory. So play theory of mass communication. I don't know about you folks, but so I live with 3 people, and 2 of us still have our jobs, and then 2 of us are kind of laid off right now. And man, they love playing video games, right? Play theory completely goes into video games. This whole notion of transporting yourself away while you're playing a video game from all the evils that are around you. A very powerful topic area inside of the field of communication. And man, I'm telling you, it's really applying to a lot of stuff that's going on right now. Okay. Next, let's see here. There are what we call speeches of demonstration. So these are traditionally what are referred to as process speeches. You're describing a process that's going on out there, but you're trying to demonstrate the actual process in front of the audience. So a lot of times, and this actually might be one of the better areas to do for this speech, because usually you just need an object or to do a demonstration, and then you can kind of show how something operates. But usually I get, a few speeches on demonstration. Almost always get a student who's like, oh, here's how you change a tire, or here's how you change your oil, or this is how you fix your computer, these kinds of things. But speeches of demonstration show the audience how to do something or how something actually operates. So, for example, how to give mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. It's usually a pretty good one that you can tend to fit into 5 to 6 minutes or 5 to 7 minutes. How to drive defensively. For the artists out there, how to mix colors might be a good speech of demonstration. How to ask for a raise, how to burglar-proof your house. More in our communication field, this notion of how perception works, like we talked about in chapter 2. How divorce laws work, maybe, how email works, how a hurricane develops, or even how a heart bypass is performed, can all be speeches of demonstration. You're sort of showing us or demonstrating to us how something actually occurs as far as life is concerned. Now, inside of the informative speech, here, are there any questions so far? Is everybody doing okay? We all good?
Fantastic.
Nice. All right. We're about halfway through here, so we should be done pretty soon. So now when you folks are doing your speech, right, you're going to have more supporting materials. So for that introduction speech, you folks just pretty much show and tell. You got a little box, you got some little examples inside of it. You're kind of showing it to the audience. But now you folks get to really take advantage of what we call the supporting materials and what Aristotle would term the inartistic proofs. So for Aristotle, he says, we have ethos, pathos, and logos, which are the artistic proofs, but you need something to apply ethos, pathos, and logos to. So he talks about examples, illustrations, narratives, testimonies, statistics. All these are supporting materials that enhance your ethos, your pathos, or your logos. So you can start off with examples. Examples tend to be pretty pathos-oriented, right? So you might have an example, a very brief instance of something that's happening in the real world, and then I might extend out that example to create an illustration of something a little bit larger, longer and sort of more sophisticated example, or I might take it all the way into a full narrative. So for some of you folks that might have taken a literature class or had a really good English teacher, they might have described the narrative process, how you start with a setting. So it was a cold and dark afternoon, and I was sitting over Zoom, right? And then you start to rise up with tension. Oh, the power of this class was starting to overwhelm me. I felt too much, right? Eventually it gets to a climax. I went crazy, And then, of course, there's the falling action, or what we call denouement, right? Where it sort of resolves in the end. I still got an A anyways. So examples, illustrations, and narratives tend to be really good at the pathos appeal, because you get to really tell a story, you get to pull at the heartstrings, you really get to the emotional heart of a lot of people that are out there. So if you're really trying to add in an extra emotional aspect of your message, using an example, an illustration, or a narrative can significantly help out. Now, for most of you folks, inside of your outlines, you're required to have 2 sources. So you probably have this testimony already built into your actual structure. So testimony is a quotation, right? These tend to be ethos appeals, right? Because you enhance your credibility by finding a good source that increases your, that you've done your research, increases your ethos, your credibility. It's a form of supporting material that's, experts' opinions or witnesses' accounts. Obviously, I don't know. I mean, if you folks are like me, you're watching the news 24/7 out there right now. And one of the most interesting things that I've been noting is the rising credibility of Anthony Fauci. The guy who's the infectious disease guy, who's up there during all of Trump's statements or whatever, his coronavirus briefings. And it's amazing, right? Because the last statistic I just heard, people are saying that Fauci has the highest credibility of anybody who's on the public stage right now. And it's interesting to think about, well, okay, so at least human beings still have some sort of faith in the CDC, or think that this guy kind of knows what he's talking about. He's been around since the 1980s. He's worked on several, Ebola and SARS and all this stuff. So he, of course, has this increased level of credibility via his testimony. Most people say now in interviews that they tune in just to hear what he has to say. We all good so far? You folks understand examples versus testimony versus illustrations versus narratives? There'll be a few test questions about this, so make sure you folks need to know the differences between them. Cool. All right. Now, in addition to this, though, you folks might also have numerical data, right? So these are the great statistics that you get to put inside your speech. A lot of people have already started off with statistics at the beginning of their speech. So that numerical data can, of course, make a lot of things more real to the audience that's out there. If you have statistics to sort of justify major claims. Numerical data can be pretty powerful, especially if you've got it in a nice little chart. I'm sure, much like me, I'm sure you folks are looking at the rising numbers of coronavirus, and every single day they got a new chart of how things are going up exponentially. That numerical data is very, very powerful out there. But the other great thing about numerical data is that you can adapt it to the timeframes of your actual audience. So I think I might have mentioned this earlier in the class, but there's a bunch of statistics that are out there, and if you can take those statistics and massage them into a 5 to 7 minute speech, odds are you can add a lot more power to them. So numerical data, of course, very, very useful supporting a wide variety of different ideas that are out there. Just remember that when you're using that numerical data, you want to make sure that you make those numbers pretty easy to remember, and then clarify your meaning using those numbers, and then connect them to something else that's out there. You also want to make sure that you reinforce your numerical data, telling us who did the study, who collected the data, do they have any biases, these kinds of things. And you don't want to be completely using numbers all over the place. Just try and find a few that really get your point across, stress the reliability of them, stress the currency of them. These are recent studies that are coming out, and more reliable studies because they've just been done by a number of different researchers. So before class started, I went and double checked a couple of them. So I guess now it's down to just in the amount of time it takes me to light this up. Somebody's going to die of smoking. I haven't waited to do this for years, smoking for the students. Yeah, I guess every 5 seconds now somebody dies of smoking or a smoking-related illness. Every minute and 40 seconds, somebody actually dies of a heart attack or heart-related illness. So it's even faster than the 2 minutes they usually quote. I guess suicides in America have increased. So now once every 11 minutes, an American actually commits suicide. And it seems like drunk driving statistics are pretty much the same. About every 25, 26 minutes, somebody dies by some sort of crash or accident or something along those lines. So if you do have, a speech that kind of falls into that area, so every 2 minutes somebody dies of a heart attack, you're doing a 6-minute speech. By the end of the speech, 3 people will have died of a heart attack. Adds a lot more power and a lot more versatility to what you're trying to talk about. And most of those numbers are from the CDC too. So I was trying to figure out a good one for coronavirus deaths, because I guess today it's 147,000 so I guess that's about half the size of Bakersfield. So I don't know, but always thinking about those numbers and how you can make them more applicable to your audience makes it more powerful. Are we all good? Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay. You also have definitions. So when you're using supporting materials, sometimes you might have a topic that's complex enough that you need to define the major terms that are out there. So when we have definitions, these are explanations of terms and concepts that may be kind of familiar to people, but you might need to further explore them or further define them in some kind of way. So if you've got a good definition, that you can pull up, usually oftentimes this makes for a more powerful speech. Now, remember, there are some pitfalls, right? So a lot of times, I think there was even a Simpsons episode where, Webster's Dictionary defines hero as. So you don't want to be one of those people who just starts off by saying Webster's Dictionary. That's kind of blasé. But sometimes good definitions can really help out. When you're thinking about different definitions, you can define them by a number of different ways. So you can define them by etymology if you want to, or linguistic development. So what's the history of that particular term? My favorite one by etymology is the term nylon. I don't know if you folks know the origin of that, but I guess when they were first working on polymers from petroleum molecules, the two major labs were in New York and in London. And so then it co-discovered it. So when they figured out what this nylon thing was, they were like, what should we name it? And so the NY is for New York and the LON is for London. So hence the term nylon. So I thought that was kind of curious. You can define it by an authority, right? So you can, get somebody who's a master in the field and they define the term and you can say, okay, well, according to Professor so-and-so or Dr. so-and-so, they say that this is X, Y, and Z. You can also define something by what it is not. So you can define by negation. So you can say, oh, well, this is not what I'm talking about at this particular moment in time, but it's something new and different. You can define it by the actual object itself. So you can grab a physical object and say, this is one of these things. And then, of course, you can also define something by its operation. So, when you think about a concept like something like an engine, well, all engines have certain parts, but then there are different types of engines, right? So if you're talking about an internal combustion engine, then you're going to talk about spark and gas and pistons go boom, that kind of thing. However, if you're talking about an electrical engine, you might be talking about magnetic forces and, circuits of electricity and Faraday, something along those lines. Are we all good so far? Everybody doing okay? Okay, so additional forms of support. So testimony and quotations, for the purposes of this class, are pretty much the same, right? So you're going to have at least 2 quotations in your speech. Ideally, you have one up in your introduction somewhere, right? So you got that credibility statement early, and then probably you have one throughout the body of your speech. You can put in more than 2 quotations if you want to. It only enhances your ethos. You can do comparisons and contrasts between 2 or more like objects that are out there. So you can compare things and contrast them against each other. And that, of course, can help explain information to your audience. You can have statements of fact about certain things, right? So like I'm sure that as you folks have been hearing about this coronavirus, one of the biggest things you've heard is that it's got a fatty lipid outside, right? And that's why soap destroys it so easily, right? So there's a fact about it that since it has a fatty outside, if you use something that cuts fat, i.e. dishwashing soap, you're going to destroy the outside of the virus and then it falls apart and goes bye. And then, of course, just the notions of repetition and restatement, of course, form their own kind of supporting material. As you're restating the major points, the audience knows to pay attention to them more, and, of course, will enhance the overall effectiveness of your particular speech. Okay, so, I thought I'd throw these in there just in case. Obviously, for this speech, presentation aids are not a big deal. However, in the future, you folks might have different types of presentation aids. Oftentimes, traditionally people do PowerPoint, just like what I've got up here, but for the purposes of this speech, you might want to think about other different types of presentation aids that you can use. So, if you are doing a speech on an actual object that's out there, I think somebody's doing their speech on vaccines, if you've got a syringe or something like that, that can be a good presentation aid, or even a drawing of a virus or something along those lines. There's, of course, models, right? So if you have a small model of a particular object, you can bring that out. You can have graphs. So if you do have a printer at access at home, or maybe if you live close enough to a Staples, you can print out like maybe just one slide of a good graph that you can put up there. The textbook talks about word charts. These are those classic flipboard kind of things, but I doubt too many of you folks have a gigantic flipboard waiting around. But if you want to go grab yourself a piece of poster board from the local, I don't know, 7-Eleven or Dollar Tree or something like that, you might be able to work out a quick little word chart. If you happen to have some maps, these, of course, can help out as well. Other people can actually be presentation aids. Oh, man, when I first started teaching, this one karate guy who was like, oh, I want to beat the crap out of somebody during my speech. I'm like, oh, boy, dude, I don't know. Right? Like, oh, I promise I won't hurt him. Okay, guy, right? So he proceeded to beat the crap out of somebody else in the class. But that one. And then, of course, finally, photographs and illustrations. These can also be good presentation aids. So got a nice little photo that you can put up, from though I doubt we have too many more real photos in the real world anymore. But if you can find a photo, these, of course, can help out with regards to presentation. When you use your presentation aids, remember that over the course of this next week, you want to practice with them, right? So you know your presentation aids. If I were you, I'd probably just maybe hold down to 1 or 2, maybe, you know, but know them intimately. Practice your speech with them in your hands in a position that kind of tries to simulate as much of the public speaking experience as possible. You want to pre-test them, you know, sort of do a sample video shot of yourself to try and see how big the presentation aid is, how big should I make it, how large does it need to be vis-a-vis my particular audience. You want to make sure you rehearse with them and then try to integrate them into your delivery style. One of the biggest problems, of course, we have is talking to your presentation aids. This is the major reason why actually I don't want you folks to do PowerPoint, is because you're going to do exactly what I'm doing right now. Right now I'm pretty much reading the stupid slides while staring at a camera. You can kind of see the little bit of difference in my eye contact, but yeah, it's not really enhancing my delivery style to you. It's a different kind of way. And then, of course, only use aids when they're relevant, which is really nice about this particular framework, because you can have a visual aid, bring it up, explain it, doop, 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 and then take it away, which is something that's a little bit harder to do, actually, when you're in a face-to-face interaction, because a lot of times we just have that slide behind us, and everybody's staring at the slide and ignoring you. But you folks are way more in control now of your presentation aids. I think that actually might be one of the only benefits that we have to being in an online type of framework. Finally, of course, presentation software, but this really isn't going to help out too much with the rest of you folks, because I really don't want to try and have you folks do PowerPoint presentations. You know, obviously, most of your professors probably use PowerPoint. It tends to add that extra up-to-date computer savvy kind of look. But you know what, to tell you the truth, you know, I've been, gosh, man, I'm teaching for like 16, 17 years now. And man, when I go back to the chalkboard and draw stupid little drawings up there, I have plenty of students who say, hey man, that stuff's a lot better than trying to read over a bunch of stupid slides and constantly write down that information. So I think maybe, you know, not using presentation aids like a PowerPoint presentation this time around might be a better situation for most of you folks. So, but just in case in the future, remember, of course, the world is now in the wide world of presentations, PowerPoints, Prezis, all these types of things. They oftentimes add that little extra blitz to your particular speech, which then takes us to the end of the presentation. Any final questions from you folks? Are we doing okay?
Yeah.